Hi there everyone, this is a short video on a little effect I found in the new pop version of Touch Designer that allows you to do these sort of really neat 3D slit scan texture displacements. Right now I'm displacing this with a noise, but if I sort of go ahead and turn that off, what we can see is that we actually have this big tesseract kind of chain of planes, and I'm able to feed through my video and my depth as this sort of depth slit scan, which I think is really cool. And also if we play with that noise and move it up and down, we can get some super cool effects as well. Really very trippy. So I'm going to kind of take this apart and start from scratch. Before we do that, let's just check out this nice fire. This technique is inspired by an artist called Andrew Benson, and he does a lot of stuff with feedback and depth buffers. And I actually played around with some of his tools fairly early on, primarily in like Maximus P and Jitter, for essentially taking video and displacing it via depth. So you get this sort of like 3D slit scan effect. And that's kind of been this thing that's ported through into these newer works. So I'm going to make a new file and let's get started. This is a super simple network and we can make this in just a few operators. We're going to start off with a grid pop, and this is so that later on we can displace this via noise if we want and have a bit more granularity to the grid points versus if we just used a plain old rectangle. We want to copy this, and let's say we're going to make 20 copies, and we want to copy this in the Z, so either 0.01 or minus 0.01 depending on what you want. I might actually go for minus 0.05 so we can see these more spread out. So now we have this stack of 20 grids layered on top of each other. What I want to do now is I want to take this into a geo, and I'm going to try and texture it with something. The way I'm going to texture it is I'm going to take my video camera. Hello. I'm just going to fit that so it's not massive. I'm going to say let's make that 400 by 400, and I'm going to say fit outside. So now we just have this rectangle. We don't want something that's going to be a different aspect ratio. Here we've got a square and we want to give it a square output. I want to create a sort of texture-based history of the last 30 or so frames, or in this case 20. Basically, we're going to match the number of copies. So I'm going to bring in a texture 3D. I'm going to plug this in, and I'm going to set my cache size to 20. In fact, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to bind these two together. So I'm going to bind my cache size and my copy size. So if I change one of them, so if I say let's do cache size of 40, it's going to bind here as well, which is really great. I'm going to create a null just in case I do any extra processing, although I don't think I have that in mind right now. And I'm going to texture my material with a fong. And what we can see is that it has applied to my texture. The issue that we're going to encounter here is that we basically have this stacked layer, but we can see it's just taking one frame. So right now we have no time displacement. And if we look at how our pops are texturing using this pop to chop and looking at the texture attribute, what we can see is that we have the UV coordinates for our texture, but we have no incremental change here of what actual piece of data is going to be mapping to that texture. So right now we just have index 0. And what we're going to do here is we're going to actually create a way of changing this value, this texture2 value, and having it ramp up from 0 to 1. So basically, if we're at 0, we're at the first index, and if we're at 1, we're at the last index. So basically, this is going to be incrementing between texture 0 and texture 30, or whatever the maximum number of textures are. It's basically a 0 to 1 ramp that moves through all of our textures. What we want to do is we want to create a way of actually moving this from 0 to 1, so we can access all of these textures and basically apply a different texture from our texture 3D on each grid. So rather than having just this one, even though that is kind of still a cool effect, we're going to have the whole time displacement moving throughout these layers. To do that, the easiest way that I have found is to add in a pattern. And a pattern allows us to do a few things. So what we can see right now is we have this, this type here. So we have ramp, sine, and 0. And let's actually create another pop2 so we can see what the new information is on our texture. Right now we can see that the texture information is the same, and by default we actually are changing these point positions. What I'm going to do is, in this output attribute scope, I'm going to go into my text, and now we are able to see something, but it's not quite right. You can do some really interesting things with playing around with this pattern, but basically what we have here is we have 3 different types, and we can think of these as values that are going to be fed to the x, y, and z parameters of our component. So for type ramp, we can see that the texture 0 is going from 0 to 1. For this x parameter of our texture, we have a sine wave, and again for this last one we have a 0. What we want to do is we actually want to have our ramp type set to 0, 0, and we want our final type for the z-axis, which is going to control our texture layers, we want that to be ramp. So we have these channels are now zeroed, and this ramp is taking us from 0 to 1. However, we have now lost our UV data, which means we are just getting basically 1 pixel. We can see that in this effect, the time displacement is working. What we can do to have our ramp and not really be affected by these 2 zeroed layers is, rather than have our combine operation to set, we can set it to add. We can also see that we have a bit of a mapping error here where my offset is a little off. So what we can do is, where it says map from low and map to high, we can say we want it to map to minus 0.5 to 0.5 and minus 0.5 to 0.5 on our x and our y. So this is now just rescaling it back into something that we can see, and we can also see that this time displacement is now working really nicely. Once I have this set up, the next kind of thing I want to do is I want to set up a render network so I can actually see all this stuff. So I'll set up a render, I'll set up a camera, and I'm going to set up just an ambient light. Let's split left and right, and let's view this as a panel. I'm going to bring this out to an out. And I'm going to replace my camera here with the camera viewport so I can actually control this. I'll relink. I'm also in my camera settings just going to access my panel comp with ... which means I'm looking at the layer above. And I'm also going to right click and say open parent parameters and turn on the middle mousing and right mousing. So now I can right click and drag, and I can middle mouse and zoom in. So this is really cool. You can see that over here we have the most recent version of me talking, versus over here we have a time delay, which is kind of interesting. I want to do some kind of filter so I don't see all these layers. And I'm also going to play around with this depth buffer a bit later. But what I want to do right now is I want to insert some kind of threshold. And this is basically going to mean I don't see everything. And I'm going to multiply this by my color value. So now we have this texture that has an alpha kind of built in. And at this point we have to start playing around a bit with our Phong to actually get some depth that we're seeing that isn't, to get this alpha depth coming through. So let's go into our Phong, press P, and under common, let's turn blending transparency on and also legacy alpha behavior. And we also want to turn our depth test off. So now we have this effect where essentially we have the alpha keyed out and we can see all of the, only the colored areas. So any area that essentially is opaque, we're not going to see. And we're only going to see these layers that have some kind of color value. So this means we basically get these little chunks in each of our grid layers, which I think is super cool. So we get this sort of trailing effect moving towards me. Or I could flip it around. Whoa. And then we're at the most recent version of me, or the oldest version of me. We can see that my talking is not quite lined up. And you get this effect. So this is something that is a really nice effect, and obviously you can play around with this. What I like to do is add in some noise to displace the grids. So let's add in a noise, and let's animate that noise in the transform section. So abstime.seconds, and we want it to be kind of slow. So let's do 0.25. I'm going to turn my period down a little bit. And I'm going to turn my amplitude up and down. Let's actually turn this up as well. So now we can see that we have this super vibey, warpy kind of texture. Once this noise is applied, a cool thing to do is to sort of zoom in on close-up elements of your image, and you get these sort of early video feedback effects, but placed through this sort of 3D depth map. We can also play around with things like this copy, so we can change how far the grid spaces are placed in the Z axis. So we could have things feeding a lot closer together, or way farther. Let's even do like 0.5. So then you can get this much longer trail. You could also play around with adding in many more instances of your texture. This is fairly sustainable on the computer, so you can have quite a lot. Let's do 0.05. And what this means is that that texture is now going to take longer to move from here to here, because we now just have more layers in our texture 3D. This effect also looks really nice with other videos, particularly if you get this thresholding right. You could even sort of play around with compositing different frames together. So if you had sort of like a stop motion animation with radically different images every couple of frames, this would be kind of an interesting effect. What we can also do, I'm just going to take down the number of copies to like 40. What we can also do is we can play around with how we're actually positioning these textures in our Z axis. So on our parameter here, So on our pattern here, we have various options. I'm actually going to remove this noise for now so we can get a better idea of how this is texturing. And I will move this up so we can kind of see too. So as I move my hand to the side, we can see that we have this sort of feedback of that position. And likewise, if I move anything to the far corners of my screen, we're going to get this sort of feedback. What I can show you here is if we play around with this pattern and change to, say, sine, we're going to get these different types of way of laying out the textures. So let's go and see how that's actually working. So what we can see is it's moving in this sinusoidal curve. We could also go in and do something like triangle. And then we can see that it's being moved in a triangle or a square pattern. And by playing around with these different effects, even changing the number of cycles as part of that effect, or automating the phase, we can create interesting jittery kind of effects as well. Let's take that down to 1. So now we have this sort of cycling depth buffer, because we can see that basically what that's going to be doing is it's going to cycle through these different positions. I'll actually just turn this off as well. There we go. Now you get sort of like this ping pong effect, so like a little image buffer, kind of a weird effect. But you can play around with having different ways of having your texture be accessed using this pattern. You could also just turn off this phase, but then you can see that the effect as you move is this nice sort of sinusoidal wave. So this is the effect for today. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this, and stay tuned for more tutorials. Bye.